Uh, tonight's presentation, Jet Search for Steam. That's not a jet of steam. It's about flying on new jet aircraft at the time. Frank Stamford's managed to pick up cheap airfares way back to Europe, Indonesia and South Africa. That he was chasing steam in all those places. I believe tonight he's mainly going to concentrate on Java. We welcome Frank Stamford to give his presentation. Thank you, Frank.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I shall just share the screen for the presentation and make that full screen view. Okay. This presentation will primarily be about Indonesia, Spain, Portugal, and 2-foot gauge in South Africa. Although I went to 10 countries, I'm confining it to those places to keep the presentation within a space of about an hour. I made the decision to go to England to see steam trains back in about 1951 or 1952. But I had to put it off because I was only 6 or 7 years old then. But, and I had visions of spending 4 or 5 weeks on an ocean liner such as the Oronce or Orchides. And by the time I was able to do this trip in 1968, almost all the British steam had gone. So the nature of the trip changed a little bit. And the need to use an ocean liner disappeared when Qantas introduced these $390 pace setter fares for Australians under 26 years of age. That was a reduction from $620 for the normal economy airfare. And it made the airfare more economic than going by sea when you took into account the amount of time wasted on the sea voyage. It was still quite expensive by today's standards. $390 for one way is equivalent to about $5,400 today, which is why the trip I made overseas lasted about 15 weeks to take advantage of the fairly high fare to get to where I was going. And looking at the fine print on this offer, it allowed at least 1 or 2 stops on the way, and Qantas was working with a number of airlines which opened up all sorts of possibilities to make interesting stops on the way there and back. Now, why did I decide to go to Indonesia? Going to Indonesia prior to about 1967 was almost unthinkable because of basically the political situation in that country. But sometime in the early 1960s, I'd seen a publication called Railway Wonders of the World, which was published in 48 parts in 1935. And one of the articles in that interesting series of publications was the world's fastest narrow gauge trains. And it was about 3-foot 6-inch gauge trains hauled by Pacific locomotives in Java, where they were maintaining speeds of about 41 miles an hour for a journey of over 500 miles, including some mountainous sections. That was a very impressive operation for 3-foot 6-inch gauge at that time. But the article also referred to 2660 Malays 2880 Malays, 212-2 tank locomotives, and a number of other interesting things. And I reckoned that was worth 3 big black asterisks, exclamation marks, I mean. It was such fascinating information, I filed it away for future reference. And the circumstances in 1968 allowed me to make a stop in Jakarta on the way to England. So on Wednesday, the 5th of June, 1968, it was the first possible date I could go to Indonesia, because there are only 2 flights a week between Sydney and Jakarta. Nobody in their right mind was going to Indonesia at that time for fun, usually only for business purposes. So I left at 7 a.m. on Wednesday by TAA to Sydney, and then on a 707 by Malaysia Singapore Airlines for a 7.5-hour flight to Jakarta, arriving about 2:30 in the afternoon. In the afternoon. And that's coming into Kemayoran Airport in Jakarta. And I was keeping a sharp lookout from the aircraft to see whether I could see any trains, and hopefully steam trains. And I did in fact see 2 black steam locomotives in operation. This was very much an unknown quantity as to what I would see, what would be running, and whether the local authorities would be hostile or friendly to photography. This is a map I made in 1971 of West Java, and some of the place names, the spelling has changed since then. Anyway, I landed at Jakarta, stayed 2 nights at Jakarta at the Hotel Indonesia, which was very expensive, but it was the only place that they would book me into in Melbourne. I said everywhere else in Jakarta was not recommended. So on the following Friday, I went by train down here through there to Bandung, which is the railway headquarters. And this was by diesel. The interesting thing about this trip is going through the Parahangyan Mountains there. At Purwakarta, I saw a shed full of Malay locomotives, much to my amazement. And these mountains were a great problem for Indonesian railways and had a great effect on the development of locomotives. Subsequently, that's about 150 kilometres from Jakarta. Subsequently, I went for 150 kilometres further to Banjar, and I also went back that way, which we'll hear about a little bit later. On the Thursday after arriving in Jakarta, I went to see a tourist agency that I'd been advised to see when I was in Melbourne. And the tourist agency was very helpful. They first of all told me that I should see the Australian embassy before I went any further, and they took me there. And somebody in the embassy told me all about the conditions I might face going east into Java, and what to eat and what not to eat, and all sorts of other do's and don'ts. And the tourist agency also took me to somebody in the railway department at Jakarta, And this person prepared an introductory letter for me to take to the railway headquarters at Bandung. So on the following day, on Friday, I travelled on the 6:30 a.m. Jakarta to Bandung Express. And this is a view from the train. This is in the Parahangan Mountains. The railway goes around here and then across that bridge and over there. That gives an example of the type of country that the railway went through the mountains. There was lots of these bridges and lots of curves. And I skipped that. That's a view from the train going over one of those bridges. And that's another view from the train. So I arrived in Bandung and I was booked into a hotel called the Hotel Istana at Bandung, which was very affordable. It was an old Dutch hotel with the rooms placed around a courtyard, and the outside of the hotel had all been refurbished, but the inside the rooms looked as if they hadn't been touched since Dutch times. But never mind, the hotel was clean, the service was good, the food was good. Each unit had a sitting room and a bedroom, a private bathroom and a toilet, which was much better than I was expecting. I had 2 spare days in Bandung, Saturday and Sunday. I had an appointment with the railway head office for the following Monday. So I had a walk around Bandung, and that's an example of what I saw in the suburbs. And at this stage, I wasn't taking any pictures of trains because I didn't know whether I would get arrested for doing that. But I did take a picture of the double-track main line here, and I was impressed by the quality of the track. And on the other side, I found this crossing keeper's hut, a very attractive looking building. I'll go back to that crossing keeper's hut and talk a little bit about what happened when I went to the railway headquarters. I had this introductory letter from the railway person in Jakarta, and I also had an introductory letter from the president of the Australian Railway Historical Society Victorian Division. That was a to whom it may concern letter, not particularly to Indonesian railways. Anyway, the reaction I got was amazing. They treated me as a VIP in effect. They allowed me to look at all their loco list, and the loco list as at the 31st of December 1967, and I handwrote all that out. Subsequently, a version of it appeared in the Continental Railway Journal in 1969, and also in an Australian magazine called Green Over Red. I also saw the loco diagram book they had. What amazed me was that almost all the locos that were working in the 1930s, examples of them were still in working order in 1968. And the variety was incredible. What's more, they said they would provide me with an engineer to take me around, and a vehicle and a driver. So first thing they did was on Wednesday, we went to the shed full of Malays that I mentioned previously at Purwakarta. And over here we can see a 2880 Alco, a row of 3 2660s, another 2660 there. There was a 282 tank off to the side here, and more interesting things inside the shed. And that's one of the 2660s. This one was built by the Dutch firm of Werkspoor in 1928. And this is the Alco of 1919, and it's obviously not in service. The valve gear is missing. I don't think that one ever operated again, but they did have 2880s of similar design built in the 1920s in Germany, in service in other parts of Java. That's 282 tank by the German firm of Hanomag of 1921. Inside the shed was this rather nice little 240 tank by the German firm of Hanomag of 1885, and a 2660 Malay tank by Hartmann of 1909. And on my train trip that I'd made from Jakarta to Bandung, I caught a glimpse of another train hauled by 2 of these at one of the intermediate stations, much to my amazement. But then I saw a lot of amazing things on that particular journey. And that's me in the middle, and the bloke on the left is the Indonesian railway engineer, and the bloke on the right is the loco foreman at Purwakarta. After Purwakarta, we went back to Karawang, which is closer to Jakarta. And amongst other things, we saw this 440 Hanomag of 1903. And that's a very interesting locomotive. It's a 2-cylinder compound. That's the low pressure cylinder. It's very large. And the cylinder on the other side is the high pressure cylinder and smaller. Also at that location was this 260 tank Hartmann of 1883. And these were the first type of locos that they used over the Parahangian Mountains. So in the 1880s, trains must have been pretty light. And there's a slightly later version of one of these also at that location, 1886. And this one has extended tanks. Also at Karawang, there was a 600mm gauge series of branch lines where they used these 060 tank Hartmanns of 1914. They also had some 080 tanks, 3 of these, but none of them are in service in 1968. And that's an example of the passenger rolling stock they used on the 600mm gauge. That's 3rd class there and 2nd class there. And this is a crossing of the 600mm gauge going across there, and a 3'6" gauge there at Karawang. I did take 1 or 2 diesel pictures in Indonesia, but not very many. This is a diesel hydraulic which I think was one of a number delivered in the early 1950s. It's a BB. And also delivered in 1951 was a class of 100 282s, these by Krupp of Germany. And this is at Tasikmalaya. That's that BB diesel loco that I showed previously. From Tasikmalaya, I travelled in the cab of this loco for a couple of hours to Banjar on a local train. The local trains all seem to be being hauled by steam, and the long distance trains being hauled by diesels, either diesel electrics by General Motors or diesel hydraulics by German firms. I got the impression, I travelled on the 1972 4-week trip to Indonesia that was organised by the Association of Railway Enthusiasts. And I have the impression that the railway situation in 1972 was much better than in 1968. And there are actually more steam locomotives working in 72 than in 68. The Indonesian railways and Indonesia generally was recovering from a period of, I would say, chaos due to bad government over a period of maybe 10 years up to 1965. And most of the rolling stock and equipment delivered to Indonesia in the 1950s had knuckle couplers. Prior to that, they used chopper couplers, and that's just the chopper knuckle transition coupling on the D52 loco. Now, just after I took that picture, I was suddenly greeted unexpectedly by a train hauled by two 0442 Malay tank locos. And I just had no time to do any adjustments to the camera to get these pictures. So the focus was all wrong, sadly. That's the same train. I particularly liked these locomotives. I like their general, the proportions and the appearance, and the wheel arrangement is unusual. That's another one of the same class in the engine shed at Banjar. And another, that one was built in 1899. Judging by what you've seen, you might gather that all the locomotives in Java were built in Germany or the Netherlands, but that's not true. There were quite a lot of Beyer-Peacock locos and also some Sharp-Stewart locos, but they weren't in the part of Java that I was travelling in, West Java. And East Java seemed to be a problem to get to at that time. Certainly, the embassy in Jakarta didn't paint a very good picture of conditions there. And that's a long distance train hauled by a diesel hydraulic, and the train that I was on hauled by the 282 at a crossing point. I had about 11 days in Indonesia, 12 days. The last full day there was Saturday the 15th of June, and the railway department, the engineer, and I went up to, back from Bandung to Jakarta on a train to have a look over the workshops at Jakarta. And amongst other things, I saw a number of electric locomotives like this one, none of which are in service, but they were being worked on. It looked as if they were trying to get them back into service. And another thing I saw there were 7 010 rack tank locomotives that had been built the previous year by Nippon Sharyo of Japan, and they were to be transported to West Sumatra at Padang. For some reason, they'd been sitting in the workshops at Jakarta for maybe 6 months or more. By the time that the Association of Railway Enthusiasts visited Indonesia in 1972, these locos were in service. I think what I didn't realise when I was on this trip was that I was in effect laying the groundwork for the ARE trip in 1972, and then a whole succession of other railway enthusiast trips to Indonesia. Okay, on Sunday, I left Indonesia on an Air India flight via Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Chennai, Mumbai, Bahrain, Lebanon, Geneva, Paris, and finally London. There are a lot of stops in those days on long distance flights. It was a 707 to Mumbai, and then a change of flight at the aircraft in the middle of the night to London. Interestingly, when I was at Jakarta Airport waiting to board the aircraft, an Englishman came up to me and said that he'd checked the passenger listings and he found I was the only person travelling all the way to London. And he said he was a writer for the Economist magazine in London, and he asked me if I would post a letter when I arrived in London. The letter was addressed to the Economist magazine, so I agreed. It seemed that he was prepared to trust a person taken at random at Jakarta to post his letter in London rather than trust the Indonesian Postal Service to get it to London. So on arrival in London, I spent quite a lot of time visiting various museums and railways and doing other interesting things, including visiting most of the Welsh narrow gauge railways. But I'll confine my photographs to this one on the Vale of Rydal, taking water at Aberford on the way to Devil's Bridge. And unfortunately, the weather was not very pleasant, to be quite honest. It's interesting that on a subsequent trip to England Wales in 1987, I travelled on the Vale of Rydal Railway and was incredibly impressed with the scenery. And my memory of the railway in 1968 had no memory of the scenery. The weather was so bad that I couldn't really see what we were passing through. Interestingly, in 1968, the locomotives were painted in this bizarre modern image livery, which I didn't like very much. I also made a visit to Ireland to pay my respects to the County Donegal Railway, which had closed at the end of 1959. And during the 1950s, I'd read a lot about this railway system, a 3-foot gauge railway system of 125 miles with 3 junction stations and 5 termini. It's a very interesting railway system, and I had visions in the 1950s of going and seeing it and travelling on it, but I couldn't do that. I saw these 2 Nasmyth Wilson 264 tanks at Strabane, and then I visited the headquarters at Stranora, and Strabane is down in that direction, Donegal is off in that direction, and Glenty's branch line is off in that direction. This is the very attractive headquarters station building, and they used to have a big veranda out there with decorative cast iron columns holding up the veranda. It was once a very busy place. Then I went to the Isle of Man, flew to the Isle of Man on Tuesday afternoon, 2nd of July, and it was raining. And it rained and rained and rained all night. And on Wednesday, the station was flooded and no trains were running, and there'd been washouts along the track and trees across the track. And the track was underwater there, and the engine shed was underwater. So that was a disappointment. But the Douglas horse tram was still running, rain or shine. And the Manx Electric Railway was still running. It runs on a 19-mile route from Douglas to Ramsey, and it was built in 1898. It was a very interesting operation and still is. The only problem is, on the day I was there, it was very cold and very wet and very windy and not very nice. The following day, the rain had stopped and they'd started running trains again on the Isle of Man 3-foot gauge railway. And they had this display of locomotives at St. John's. On the left, you see the very first of the famous Bio-Peacock 240 tanks for the Isle of Man, number 1 Sutherland, and then number 6 Peveril with a somewhat larger boiler, and the last one to be built, number 16 Mannon of 1926, with a much larger boiler and a more modern cab. And that picture looks very misty because that's how the weather was. Now, I did see some industrial railway operation in England. In the south of England, I went to visit the Bowaters Sittingbourne Kemsley 2-foot 6-inch gauge railway. And they had, amongst other things, this 042 saddle tank. They had a lot of steam locomotives, 042 saddle tanks and 062 tanks, all with interesting names like Excelsior. In August, I went to after that, after England and Wales, I went to Spain, and this is the map I made to send back with letters home at the time. I came in by train from France to Hendaye, where change of gauge from standard to 5 feet 5.5 of Spain. This map only shows the railways that I travelled on in Spain and Portugal. So I went by broad gauge train to Valladolid, and then meter gauge up here to Palanquinos, broad gauge train back to Valladolid and Madrid, then broad gauge train to Lisbon in Portugal, and broad gauge train from there to Porto in Portugal, where I visited a very interesting meter gauge system. Then a broad gauge train to Regua and visited an amazing, in a number of respects, an amazing meter gauge railway to Chaves. Then I returned to Spain and went down to Valencia and travelled on the Cartagena-Denia meter gauge line. But that was a terrible disappointment. I was expecting a 440 saddle tank by a Peacock loco, but it had just been dieselised. So we won't be seeing any pictures of that line. And I then went up to Girona and travelled on a meter gauge line towards Olot and a 750 millimetre gauge line to San Feliu de Guíxols. And then I left Spain, changed trains again to standard gauge and went off to Switzerland. In this presentation, I'll be covering the this meter gauge line with just one photograph, and then this meter gauge line here with quite a lot of photographs, and this 750 millimetre gauge line, and then I'll cover the Portugal. So the first meter gauge line that I saw in Spain was from Valladolid to Palanquinos. It was actually 2 meter gauge lines that met in the middle at Medina de... I can't see that on my screen, unfortunately.
Rio Seco.
Medina de Seco, right. And the first part of the trip was in a diesel rail car. Then I changed to a proper train hauled by a 268 tank, this one, and went off to Palanquinos. This railway looked very, very run down and as if it was on its last legs, and it was. It didn't last a year. And in fact, that was the case for all the narrow gauge lines that I travelled on in Spain. None of them lasted more than another year. So then I went to the Olot and Girona railway, which was very, very interesting and has a wonderful history, had a wonderful history. It was an English company, and it had a lot of very English attributes, which you'll see some of. This is Girona station. The station building is down there. That's the carriage shed. There's an interesting rake of vehicles here. The loco is there, the loco shed is over there. And I had about 2 hours to waste here because I was waiting for the train, which didn't go until 6:30. And as a result, I could walk over the whole place and make a sketch plan of the track layout. And I subsequently made this diagram. The red lines are the broad gauge of the Spanish state railways, with transfer facilities to the meter gauge here, and sidings off to a factory in both gauges here. One of the interesting features of the track layout, I thought, was all these wagon turntables, 6 of them. And there are also 2 wagon turntables on the broad gauge. Then there was a loco turntable here, the station building here, goods shed here, engine shed there, water tank, water crane, and carriage shed. And somewhere down here off the plan is the standard gauge, no, the broad gauge station. And on the other side of the broad gauge station was a 750mm gauge station for the Stamford to Gizols line. So that's the loco turntable at Girona. And that's part of the station building. Those are the wagon turntables, 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6 down there. And this is the rake of carriages that would form the 6:30 train that I was travelling on. And these 3 cars are very, very English. It's another one of the passenger cars, which is just pure 100% English, I would say, maybe apart from the couplings. And that's one of the passenger cars on the train. Could well be the carriage I travelled in. And this is one of the cattle wagons. And that's also very English in style. And the first locos used on the line were English, but they were no longer running. It's just the loco that was to haul my train, a 262 tank by Maquinista of Barcelona in 1926. And there's the train ready to depart, and it's a bit of a mixed train. There's a couple of goods vehicles there. I was only travelling half the distance to Amur, and the train would lose those 2 vehicles at Amur. At Amur, I was transferring to a train back to Olot, and it was a diesel rail car. The timetable didn't allow me to make the full trip. So this is my train at Amur. The loco has now dropped off the goods vehicles. And you'll notice that it all looks very, very decrepit and run down. And the only thing that wasn't decrepit and run down was the diesel rail car. Now we go on to the 750mm gauge line, the Stamford to Gizols line, which is very attractive. And the loco in use there was an 062 Krauss of 1893. Interestingly, what you see there is possibly what might have been a Victorian Railways NA class, because the Victorian Railways, when they were seeking locomotives for their narrow gauge lines, wrote to Krauss amongst other loco suppliers. And this was a standard Krauss design for railways of about 2 foot 6 gauge. They were very widely used in Europe. So that's the train on the Saint-Filiu de Guizols railway at one of the termini, and I'm not sure which one. And that's at the other termini. So now we go to Portugal and the very attractive city of Lisbon with great architecture and lots of very interesting 900mm gauge trams running through very narrow, curvy, steeply graded streets. Although that's not narrow and curvy, that is an example of their 900mm gauge trams, about ½ an inch less than 3 foot gauge. And they still have a tram system, I'm pleased to say. They also had a number of funicular trams because Lisbon is a city of lots of hills. And although it's cable hauled, it's got a pantograph. And the electric supply is apparently for lighting and braking, I think. After things were pretty much dieselised in Lisbon, but I went up north to Porto, which also had a nice tram system, but better still, it had a metre gauge steam operated railway system with 6 platforms on the metre gauge station, and almost all the Portuguese stations were very well kept, very well looked after, and they had these attractive gardens. There were 3 different types of steam locos in use on this system, like these 0440 Malays, this one built by Henschel of 1908. These 260 tanks, like this one built by Kessler of Esslingen, Germany in 1886. And the most modern were these 282 tanks built by Henschel in 1931. And that's platform 3 with an 0440 tank on a train ready to depart for, I'm not sure where. There were a number of branch lines, or a number of lines that went out from this station. It was sort of semi-suburban. From Porto, I went east to a place called Regua. I travelled on a diesel-hauled train. It was General Motors diesel. But at Regua, the diesel came off, and this rather magnificent 460 with inside cylinders glided into the station to take over from the diesel. There's the diesel. But I wasn't travelling on this, behind this fascinating loco. I was travelling on the metre gauge railway to Chaves behind this 2460 Malay tank. And I decided to lash out and travel first class here. Something told me that travelling first class would be advantageous, and it certainly was. The last carriage on the train was the first class carriage, and it had an end platform which I could travel on, and it gave magnificent opportunities for photography. There was also hardly any other people in the carriage. So that's looking back towards Regua, railway came over that bridge. And this railway was extremely scenic and had a number of other features which completely, totally discombobulated me. We'll come to that in a minute. That's an example of the scenery. This is wine growing country. And this is approaching the first crossing station on the trip. There were 2 crossing stations. We passed trains at each of the crossing stations. That red carriage there is a post office car. So I was looking across the valley whilst travelling on this train, and suddenly I saw this other train travelling. I was travelling along in this direction down here, and I saw this other train paralleling us, up the other side of the valley. And we were both approaching Carrizado crossing station, which was on a horseshoe curve around here somewhere. And this phenomenon of seeing the other train paralleling my train lasted for quite some time. And that's at the crossing station, Carrizado. This is my train here, and the train bound for Regua here. So this is again taken from the end platform of my train. Carrizado station is down here off the picture, so that my train had come up around there and then here. And this lady looks as if she's come up from the train, from the station, and she's got her shopping in both hands and on her head. This is terminus station at Shaves. And again, has a very nicely maintained garden. On the next day, I did the return journey, and that's coming into Carrizado station. This time I'm on the high side of the valley, and my train is coming in around here and then around the big horseshoe and coming in there. What really amazed me about this line was that the phenomenon of Carrizado station being on a horseshoe curve was repeated at the second crossing station. And you could see the other train approaching at both crossing stations. So I came to the conclusion that the civil engineer who designed this railway must have had railway enthusiast photographers in mind when he worked out the route of the railway. So that's one of the 2460 Malay tanks at Regua. And that was the exclusive type of motive power being used on the Regua Shaves Railway. There are no other types of steam loco, and it hadn't been sullied by diesels at all at that stage. It's a most unusual wheel arrangement, but they seem to work very well. And they also had a whistle, which I found quite attractive. It was rather similar to a Victorian Railways NA class, Puffing Billy type loco. They did have a smaller loco as the yard shunter at Regular on the meter gauge. This 060 tank built by Kessler in 1889. In August, I spent most of my time in Germany, Switzerland and Austria, and some time back in England and Wales. And I had to start my return journey to Australia before September, or else I was marooned until April the following year. This was one of the limitations of the payset affairs, or I would have to return by boat. So on the 30th of August, I left London on a South African Airways flight, stopping at Paris, the Canary Islands, which is Spanish territory, Luanda in Portuguese Angola, Salisbury in what was then Rhodesia, it's now Harare, Zimbabwe, and then Johannesburg. And whilst in South Africa for a couple of weeks, I certainly saw the mainline 3-foot 6-inch gauge railways with their enormous locomotives. I'm going to concentrate on the 2-foot 6 gauge here, 2-foot gauge here, with one exception. That's an industrial 3-foot 6-inch gauge 482 tank at the Randfontein Estates and Gold Mining Company in Johannesburg. Although that loco was built in either 1935 or 38 by the North British Loco Company, it's a type that was used from about the turn of the century in Natal. It was a very widely used on the 3-foot 6-inch gauge around about 1900 on the main lines. So we go to the 2-foot gauge. I went down to Port Elizabeth in the south of South Africa with the intention of looking at the Avontour Railway, which was a famous 177-mile long line with lots of traffic and lots of steam engines. But unfortunately, Port Elizabeth had just had about 24 inches of rain in 24 hours, and that was unprecedented apparently. And Humewood Road Station, which was the 2-foot gauge station, had been underwater. And there were no trains running, and the station master told me that it was unlikely any trains would be running for about a week. The locos had been underwater, which explains why the smoke box is all rusty. It's a 2-foot gauge 282. And that's 262 plus 262 by a Garrett. And again, it's a Garrett. Again, that's been underwater. The chimney's all rusty. So I headed away from Port Elizabeth and went up to Natal, where there are other 2-foot gauge railways. At Umzinto, I saw this row of, I think there are 7 262 plus 262 Garretts of the NGG 16 class there. I don't know what they were doing, but this loco was moving these locos backwards and forwards. And these locos, some of these locos had just been built. I think this one was brand new. And I don't know whether they were testing its haulage capabilities or whatever, but it was a good site for photography. There were no passenger trains on this line, but by paying a first-class fare, I was allowed to travel in the break van of one of these trains from Umzinto. I went out to the first station in Quifa at 8 kilometres, and that was the train I was travelling on. And we crossed another train here, which I travelled back to Umzinto in. However, I was staying at a hotel at Umzinto, and in front of the hotel there was a 2-foot gauge sugar tramway, which I wasn't expecting and knew nothing about. And once I saw the sugar tramway, I lost all interest in the South African railways, and I had to follow the sugar tramway. So I walked down the sugar tramway and found the Esperança sugar mill. And this 048 tank Avonside loco was shunting there. Loco number 5. And then a train came in with a load of sugar cane, hauled by another Avonside, and that was number 1 of the fleet. Then I found a good vantage point for photography away from the mill, and this train of empties came along from the mill, and the driver saw me and he stopped and he invited me into the cab of the loco. So that we went out along one of the sugar lines and stopped to pass this train coming in with a load of sugar cane. And that was only a brief look at what happened on that journey. It was quite interesting. My travel diary says quite a lot about it. The following afternoon, I did a walk along another one of these tramways, in the tramway that ran in front of the hotel. I went in the opposite direction of the mill, and I walked about 4 miles. I didn't see any other train, but what I did find was a zigzag, and the track comes up here and then zigs, goes down there, and then comes back here. And that was a very interesting feature and unexpected. Anyway, on Monday the 16th or Tuesday the 17th of September, almost the last day of my trip, the Railway Society of South Africa had organised a visit to the Hunslet Taylor Works at Johannesburg, where the last NG G16 Garrett was undergoing testing, just been built. And there it is there. And there it is again. So that is almost the end. Yeah, well, it is effectively the end. On Wednesday, the 18th, I went by South African Airways on a 15-hour flight via Mauritius, Perth to Sydney. On a 707, and then back to Melbourne on a TAA 727, where I arrived back at about 1:30 on Wednesday afternoon. And that is the end of that. Yeah, that's the end. So pass back to Bill if he's there.
Yeah, very well done, Frank. Most interesting. Quite a lot of steam locos you saw.
Yeah, that was only a sample.
Yeah. No, fascinating stuff. Yeah, no, it was sort of at a time you were lucky to catch a lot of that stuff.
Actually, you're absolutely right. I was certainly lucky in Spain, but the timing was absolutely perfect and spot on for Indonesia. It was hardly possible before then, and it wouldn't have been possible if I'd been travelling by sea. And yeah, the timing was perfect in that respect.
No, it was excellent. All right, anyone got any questions?
I've got one to start off with, Frank.
Yep.
You would have been in your mid-20s then, I think. Is that about right?
23.
How on earth did you manage to organise that with your employer at the age of 23? It's because it's not like today. That would have been a project in itself, just the organising of such a trip.
Yes, I don't know that it wasn't that difficult to organise. One of the most difficult parts was making sure I had enough money for it. And one of the important things to achieve that was not buying a car as soon as I turned 18, because that's the way to stay poor. And as I said, I decided to do the trip when I was 6 or 7. And so it was always an intention to do it as early as I possibly could. I had been working for ICI for about 14 months, and when I actually applied for the job at ICI, I said, what's the situation if I wanted to go overseas for a while? And they said it was possible to get unpaid leave for extended period if I wanted it. So that's what happened.
Remarkable, really is.
I did an enormous amount of research into Indonesia. Yeah. I had to. A lot of what I saw was extremely disturbing, to be quite honest. And from time to time I said, oh, I'm not going there, I'm not going there. And then I sort of said, no, I have to go there because it's on the way. And something told me I had to go there, despite it was interesting that I had a very detailed saw a very detailed document that had been prepared in 1940 by military authorities in Melbourne, and it had all the details of locomotives as they existed in 1940 in Java. And apart from a little bit of information on deliveries in about 1952 and 53, I had no up-to-date information on what the railways were like in Indonesia.
It was amazing, an amazing achievement, just putting that together, in my view, anyway. With all the tools we have available today, you know, something like that would be still challenging, but to do that back then, I think it's pretty amazing.
I was supposedly being helped by a travel agent in Melbourne who was specialising or trying to specialise in travel to Indonesia, but I think they were fairly dodgy. They seemed to go out of business while I was, before I even left. And they had supposedly advised the travel agent that I caught up with in Jakarta about what I wanted to do in Indonesia. But the travel agent in Jakarta said they'd heard nothing about that. I was actually quite amazed at the helpfulness that I got from the Indonesians, because what you read in newspapers in Melbourne sort of gave the impression that they might be hostile or difficult, and they weren't, none of them.
Mm. It's great.
All right. Anyone else? Got a question?
I've got a comment, Bill. Frank, people might know, but I'm the current president of the ARE, the Association of Railway Enthusiasts, and we're in the throes of winding up.
Yes.
And our last edition of the magazine's just been published, and it includes a list of all our overseas tours as well as all our local tours. And the trip that you went on with the ARE was actually our third overseas tour.
Yes.
And it was in two parts. So it was number 3A and number 3B.
That's right. They were a week apart.
And so it's just a coincidence that you mentioned that. I might chuck in a little ad, if that's okay, Bill. The last edition of the magazine has arrived. Members have got it. It's 224 pages. It's actually a book.
Right.
So and it's got lots of interesting stuff. So if anybody wants a copy, we have some stock. It's $20. I'll put my email in the message if that's okay. And if people want to contact me, they can. It is available at Train World. They normally take 10 copies, and I dropped them off last Sunday and they rang me up and asked for another 30. So if you live down that way. But anyway, I don't want to take over the meeting. I just thought I'd mention it. That's all.
All right. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah, I gave a presentation to the ARE in about March 1969 on that trip. I had a little bit of involvement in the organisation of the 1972 trip.
Oh, I'm sure you would have been a wealth of knowledge for them, Frank.
Well, yes, I was, although there were quite a number of other people who had travelled shortly after I did.
All right. Very good. More questions?
Frank, did you get a chance to get to the northwest of England in your 1968 trip? Because when you were there in June, there was still a few weeks to go.
Yes.
About 4 or 5 weeks. You know, there were only Black 5s and 8Fs and so forth. But
yes, that's right. Yes, I did. Mike Swift, actually, I met up with Mike Swift, and he took me around various places like that. But certainly it was only a shadow of its former self, and nothing like what I was seeing in magazines in the 1950s.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I think what is really interesting about your trip is certainly from the British perspective, it was only way out or sometime after 1968 that the general enthusiasts started going abroad to places like South Africa. The Locomotive Club of Great Britain used to run trips in the 70s for a weekend to Portugal to see the steam out of Porto and the like.
Yes.
It sort of caught on later on, but you know, going across to France to see the Northern French steam before it ended was about most people's extent of travels. But you really were a pioneer. No, well done. It's been a very interesting show. Thank you very much.
It's interesting that the reason why they brought in those pace setter fares was to get young people attuned to the idea of travelling overseas by air, because they knew that once the jumbo jets came along, the price of air travel would fall a lot, and they wanted to get people, their future customers, attuned to the idea of not going by sea, but going by air. But the fares were still sufficiently high to mean that you needed to be away for a fairly long time to make it worthwhile. Whereas the last two international trips I did were for about 18 days each, from Australia to Norway. That was unthinkable unless you were very rich in 1968.
Just thank you very much, Frank, for your presentation. It was very enjoyable. It throws me back memories of when my father did a similar trip like yours in 1970.
Yes.
He like yourself, he did a lot of research and discovered there was steam was disappearing in a lot of parts of the world. And I remember seeing he did touch on Indonesia. It was one of the places he touched on his way through to Japan and eventually across Russia. Very interesting. But I was just going to ask you also about the Isle of Man. Do you know, is those locos preserved? Did they make it into preservation? And is that Isle of Man Railway still running today? Do you know?
Part of it is. And I think most of the locos are preserved.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. The Loco Club of Great Britain are running a trip to the Isle of Man, I think at the end of July. The Isle of Man Steam Railway from Douglas to Port Erin is still very much extant. Frank, you showed pictures of a Douglas station underwater. It's been very much reduced in size and status since then, but the Isle of Man Steam Railway still flourishes, as does the Manx Electric Railway, and as also the Groudle Glen Railway, which is a little, well, not quite sure what the gauge is, 2 foot at the most. It's served by a station off the Manx Electric Railway, and it went to basically an aquarium type area. I've been there once. But the Isle of Man is very much a transport treasury, and the Isle of Man Steam Railway still functions very much. I'm not in possession of details of the loco stock, but my good friend Colin Meal, who's a club member, is running the trip in the end of July. He loves the Isle of Man, and if you wanted a presentation on that, then let me know and I can contact him, and I'm sure he'd be happy to do a Zoom meeting for you. Oh, there we go. Have we lost you? Anyway, thank you very much indeed, Frank, for a fascinating. Thank you.
I was also going to add that
I can just add to that. I travelled on the Isle of Man about 4 or 5 years ago, and very, very popular. They were even running a commuter train, which was amazing. And of course, it's only the one route now, but and as Bob just said, the Douglas station is only a shadow of what once was, but what's left is still well and truly worth visiting. And they put a lot of focus on preserving the locomotive stock and keeping what they have in really good order. It doesn't operate all year, but when it does operate, it's a fantastic thing, as are the other preserved rail trips on the Isle of Man. They're all terrific. You know, you can even the Manx Electric. When I was there, they ran a special on the Manx Electric to take you up to the was it the Vale of, what was it, the little 2-foot thing, Bob? The Dougal.
Groudle Glen Railway.
That one,
Yeah.
yeah. It's a kind of it's not so much a preserve railway, it's a created one, but it's well and truly a fun thing to travel on. And so I actually work at Puffing Billy as a volunteer on Wednesdays, and we get a lot of English people coming through. I take great delight in asking them when did they last visit the Isle of Man, because back in the 20s or thereabouts, it was where the English went for their holiday. Of course, they don't these days, and so I'm yet to find someone who's actually been there. So I've always had a one-up on them. Yeah, but it is a wonderful place.
There's been controversy about the horse-drawn tram, and that was withdrawn and suspended for some time. They have reintroduced it, but on a very short section and a very limited operation.
That's really sad, because I went when I was there, you could go the full length from around near the ferry terminal, I think it was, right round to the Manx Electric and where the horse sheds were. And I do not understand why they've done what they've done.
Well, they refurbished it, and then there was a dispute between the council and the contractors eventually walked off site. I was there about 4 years ago, and some of the track was down, some of it wasn't. Nothing was running on the horse-drawn tram. And just referring to your South African experience, regrettably, there's no narrow or 2-foot gauge left in operation. They are trying to restart what they call the Apple Express. Van Staden's viaduct is no longer safe to be operated over, so it would be a very truncated and limited journey. And they use NG15s and a couple of Garretts. And in fact, Puffing Billy have got a couple of Garretts from the Alfred County Railway, which collapsed many years ago.
I gave one of them a pat last Wednesday. It's that they run it quite regularly. 3 gauge, 2'6".
Yeah, one's been stuffed and mounted, I think, hasn't it? And the other,
no, not so much stuffed and mounted, but put in the museum in good nick. But it's the intention is to restore it at some point. They'll need it at some point. Because
your shale climax doesn't really have much pulling power.
No, but you don't use that for normal. The climax is actually getting quite a good bit of use in more recent times. They run specials with it. You can't really run anything regular with it. And the Shay, of course, is from Taiwan, and it is stuffed and mounted, but there is certainly a bit of enthusiasm to have it restored. But you know, it suffers from not having been a Victorian locomotive in Australia, so it's going to take a special effort to get that going. But the climax runs, but it runs very slowly, as it's designed to do. And Frank was actually on a trip behind it only about a week ago.
Last Saturday.
Yeah.
And
sold out trip.
Yes, and it kept up with the traffic that was running alongside it on the footpath.
Well, I must say, my wife and I have visited Puffing Billy a couple of times and thoroughly enjoyed the experience.
I'm actually.
And thank you for an excellent presentation this morning.
So Mike, just a slight clarification about the Groudle Glen Railway. It's the Isle of Man's equivalent of the Sorrento Tramway. It opened in 1896, so it is in fact a preserved tourist railway, if you like to put it that way.
My understanding is that oh, look, I won't say anything because I'm going to be wrong. But
You can't beat Mr. Google.
No, but there's evidence at the end of some of the track work from the earlier op, but what they run on now, I think, has been well and truly, laid over an old formation. In fact, a lot of the old track, the rail, you can still see alongside the track as you go along.
Frank, may I allow a question?
Yes.
Did you ever return to Java after your tremendous amount what you saw in Java on Steam? Did you ever return to Indonesia?
I went on the Association of Railway Enthusiasts tour in 1972. The first, I think that was the first international organised tour by railway enthusiasts to Java. That was a very comprehensive tour. It went over most of Java, and it went to West Sumatra and to North Sumatra, and it saw all the various interesting type of locos, including the 212-2 tanks and the 010-0 rack tanks in West Sumatra, 042 rack tanks in central Java, a number of interesting, rather strange locomotives in North Sumatra, lots of steam trams in central Java. Yeah, that was an extremely comprehensive trip.
And when do you show us these pictures?
I took lots of pictures in 1972. Hundreds, I'd say.
Frank,
I think that
we
means
want you to show them to us, mate, but not
That's right.
tonight.
What's that?
You've got to show them to us, but not tonight.
Oh no.
Yeah. Let's look after Gunter. I think that means that we've got another presentation from Frank coming up with a.
So do you want a comprehensive Indonesian meeting at some stage?
Please.
Definitely.
Oh, by the way, that reminds me, the next I intended to mention this in the actual presentation. I noticed that the next meeting that we're putting on is about Indonesian Malay locomotives, I think, and that includes industrial locomotives, and they had.
That's right. That's Ross Sadler, Frank. That's Ross Sadler who will be presenting it for us.
Yes, I don't know the presenter, but I'm certainly looking forward to the meeting.
On this subject,
he's here tonight, so
is he?
Right. Well, he was. I don't know if he still is, but checking you out, no doubt, before he comes along in 2 months' time.
Did ARE get to Aceh at all when in North Sumatra?
Oh, no.
That was always regarded as the Holy Grail and the cult and too difficult. And with
yes, the local people were very independent, and I think on some of I'm not sure what my visa said. Actually, I would have had two visas, one for 68 and one for 72. But I think one of the visas said not available for Aceh. The Indonesian government actually had difficulty keeping the locals under control.
Mm.
Can I just ask, Frank, do you know if there's a preservation group today and how many of the locos have been preserved at all on the various systems?
Oh, there are a number of preserved locos. I'm not up to date with where they are or how well they're kept or anything like that. But I do know that there are quite a lot of active new railway enthusiasts in Indonesia.
Mm.
Perhaps I could answer some of that. Frank, firstly, thank you hugely for your presentation tonight. I'm just getting over the flu, so I'm sorry I'm not as lucid as I should be, but it was great.
Ross, Frank, meet Ross.
Oh, Frank, hello.
Yeah. Hello,
Frank,
Ross.
the things really stood out to me tonight about your presentation. There was the presentation on South African sugar lines, because that is something that's been virtually neglected by people. We've seen the Bagnall Myers, we've seen the Avonside Heislers, but the run-of-the-mill things is forgotten. The same thing, the other continent down the south, the Argentinian ones there, just neglected. So huge thank you for showing us those. And I will just say one little personal reminiscence about Indonesia. This is 1975. You had that BB diesel hydraulic thing. I'm eternally grateful to one of those, because we set out for Yogyakarta from Surabaya, and the thing it failed at Kertosono. Well, there's all sorts of stuff going on there. Your 212-2 tanks, I couldn't believe it. The wheels just kept coming, as you no doubt found. But anyway, the good thing was that there was a branch line train with a D52 on it. And after a lot of fooling around, they pulled that D52 off and put it onto our train. And so we were steam hauled to Jogja. And as to the people in that branch line train, they might still be sitting there for all I know. But Frank, thank you very much.